Jack.
He's Jace. And today we're going to be continuing on from what we discussed last time, I think, was influences and world building. For anyone out there looking to make a homebrew campaign or setting that isn't quite sure of where to start. So hopefully this provides some practical advice. And last time we talked about media and certain touchstones, and used the example of your first game that was
Plagiarism.
Plagiarism, yes, by any other name.
So what about you?
So I, well as borrowing, like to use historical influence as well. So obviously this can go into quite dark places. So it's probably something worth talking over with your table, especially if you're using something that's particularly egregious or a horrific moment in humanity's history. Where if you're obviously going back a little bit more, it has that dilution of the past where it sort of fades into the mists and the sands of time. And you can use influences like somebody like Genghis Khan or Attila the Hun as a basis for that overarching villain, but also the landscape and the nature of the peoples. Are they nomadic or horse riding peoples? And the same with obviously kind of going into again something which, especially given my history, is a bit of a sore spot if you're looking at especially things like that colonial era, which again check it with your group before you begin anything. But using that of the strangers in a strange land and threatening hostile takeover type of environment.
If you don't want to go into too much detail about it, I completely understand since it's an ongoing campaign, but aren't there some real-world references going on in what happens in the Dusk? Obviously.
There
Keep
is.
spoilers.
There is. I will keep spoiler free, but again, this is something that might not sit well with your particular group, seeing as how we've recently come out of something very similar with the COVID pandemic. But for what happens in the Dusk, our Blaze in the Dark campaign, I have been doing a little bit of digging, and specifically into the 1919, I believe, outbreak of the Spanish flu, which was worldwide. Similar situation, but much more controlled. It wasn't of an era where we've got the same access to media. So in some ways it might have been even more oppressive. I can't speak from personal experience, but the idea of setting up quarantine hospitals and the desolated streets, curfews, so on and so forth. Obviously, many of us in various parts of the world faced lockdowns and social distancing, but there was still that level of freedom that you were permitted. Whereas from what I understand, the Spanish flu, that was much more pervasive and influential on people's lives. So if that sounds like something that could be of interest, then check out the campaign. Hopefully there's a link coming up somewhere here at this point.
Oh. Put that on the editor, eh?
So that's an active example of that historical influence, and then also meeting certain fictional touchstones as well, which will probably become fairly obvious to anyone who's a gamer or likes their movies.
That being said, obviously when you're dealing with historical references, accuracy to a certain extent is imperative. How do you go about making sure that things are portrayed while still fitting the fictional setting somewhat accurately?
Again, this is what your group is facing. I was running to give you an example, I was running a campaign several years ago now with a game of Changeling the Lost, and one of the characters had been gone for the best part of half a century, and he was the both the player and the character he was playing were black or are black characters, and he's obviously a black player. So the way we kind of touched on that was obviously the changes in the world that had transpired. That he was coming out of the 1950s. So in something like that, it was much more of a kind of progressive idea where he was facing things that he didn't quite know how to contend with that situation. Now, obviously, if you're playing a game in that particularly racially charged era, then it might be worth, as a group, toning it down. But obviously, when you're suddenly in the modern era, and if you've got a character from that background who hasn't seen the change in the civil rights movements, facing those changes and the somewhat kind of liberating moments for that character of now he doesn't have to use the back door or use a segregated bathroom, and there's those kind of light moments in Changeling, which is essentially a very dark campaign. So really up to you and your group, but some things might be worth just dialing back, having that influence maybe in the world, that pervasive outward force, but obviously kind of as players, as a group, you want to be getting on with your player base. So having initially sort of setting something up which is just going to separate them from the off, be it racial, be it based by gender, religious beliefs, whatever it might be. Sometimes it's worth just giving it a little bit of an aside. But I think one thing is that I think it's important to recognise that was the state of the world. That's where we're coming from, and we're not there yet. I think anyone would probably admit that there's still issues, and I think avoiding those issues is almost as bad as buying too heavily into them. And I think there is a middle ground, and this is where the use of X cards and what I've seen referred to as landmines, which is when you hit something which is people don't realise is necessarily a veil or a line, and you hit it in your storytelling, and sometimes it's one of those things that just happens. The thing is then, it's then as a group and as people and as players talking about it, saying, okay, we'll avoid that in the future, but not holding it against your storyteller or your other players for something that might be potentially problematic.
And of course, this always comes back to having a proper session zero also helps mitigate situations.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, you do get those games. Call of Cthulhu is obviously the one that springs to mind from the mind of ever problematic H.P. Lovecraft in ever problematic 1920s. So again, that session zero, and playing a very, very dark game, dealing with sanity and as well as those various tensions. Talk to your group.
Especially insanity in a gamified format.
Yeah.
Which is by no means realistic.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, obviously handling mental health and the consequences of it with all the subtlety of smashing an egg with a paving slab. So it's sort of less on the world building, and I suppose this time around, but certainly hopefully some advice that you can use, and especially if you're using historical influences and historical settings where certain themes are recurrent throughout history, but hopefully you can use those, know what to incorporate into your game, know what to set aside or not have as a prime spotlight focus, and hopefully that gives you a great and memorable campaign setting that you and your players will both love at the time and reminisce about for years to come.
I suppose until next time, he's Jack.
And he's Jace.
We'll see you
next time.